Hey, fifth grade. We're going to pick up today where we left off and talk some more about rock and roll and how it changed in the 60s and 70s. From where the Beatles and the Stones had sort of left it when we last talked, with kind of a more, sort of group centric, lighter sound, really like poppy lyrics, really catchy, and how it got to sort of where it is in the 70s, where it's a little bit more just rock. There's no more roll. Everything's a little bit harder edged. There's a lot more low end sound, a lot more emphasis on like bass lines, and how sort of the electric side of things starts to really take over. So while the Beatles and the Stones were doing their thing in the 60s, there was also a really strong folk scene that was happening. And this has been passed down from people like Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger and all these greats in the US who have been writing music by the people for the people. It's almost like chronicling all these old songs that had been part of our folklore and other cultures' folklore and turning them into a more modern day sharing. And someone who picked this up in the 60s was Bob Dylan, and he really became sort of the icon of the folk music scene. And so what happened was that Bob Dylan was getting a little bit tired of the sounds that folk music traditionally was using, which were all acoustic instruments, no electric, really just simplicity is best, and it's all about the lyrics and the message. And he started to move more towards an electric sound, and actually was one of the first folk artists to use an electric guitar in a concert, and was actually booed on stage because of it, because people felt he had betrayed the folk trust. And this sort of led to a merging more of the folk music with rock, and sort of started giving it harder edge. And other people who were part of that movement were people like Joan Baez and Joni Mitchell, but they also were on the lighter end of things. But they all started to merge their sounds a little bit with that rock and roll. The other thing that started really happening then was that more and more synthesizers and pedals for guitars and other ways of creating electronic music really started to catch on. And you started hearing more and more that like heavy guitars or doubling guitars started to take on. And this sort of led to a sort of emphasis in some areas of the more virtuoso approach, where instead of having music that was all about like the mass appeal and the lyrics and the singing, you started to get these groups that were really focusing just on playing guitar or playing as a group, or like improvising on their instruments and showing off how good they are at these instruments. And you really start to see that with bands like Cream, or obviously like Jimi Hendrix in the States, who really like pushed what we thought a guitar could do. And then it kind of in the 70s got taken on by bands like Led Zeppelin and Pink Floyd, who sort of continued to take Pink Floyd, especially of the long cut that Cream had started. A long cut being those sort of improv, really long music songs or tracks that you hear, where there's not a lot of vocals happening. It's just musicians playing their instruments together and feeding off each other's energy, and taking these really long takes in the recording studio that eventually get put on a record somewhere. The other thing that we started to see is the theatricality of rock. So now we think about rock and roll as like, like huge stages with lots of costumes, especially from that time, and like makeup and face paint and like all things that sort of came out of like the theater tradition, especially in Britain, which is where vaudeville especially was. You started to see that with bands like, Bowie and Queen and Iggy Pop, all who took on this persona, and that was their band. It was almost a character that they were playing on stage. And this was especially dominant in Britain, where again they came out of the vaudeville tradition, as opposed to the US, where you were supposed to be cool and laid back and just yourself, and we wore jeans. Whereas in Britain, you were all about the production of it. People, especially like David Bowie, really changed that when they would create David Bowie would create fictional characters in his music that he would then be on stage. You have like Major Tom, Ziggy, all these different characters that he sings about, but actually sings about from their perspective and as their character. So yeah, so that's basically where things started to move. You started to get a harder sound underneath. You started to get more virtuosic performances, which before then had been more of a classical thing. Classical music obviously loves to like show off how good you are at your instrument, and push the limits of that. Whereas it was a new thing for rock and roll to start doing that. And then also you started to get a lot more theater and performance aspects where you're getting these big productions on stage. So that's about where things started to go, and we'll keep talking about it. All right, see you later.